Hey everyone, welcome to a video I've been actually really looking forward to making, which is sharing my thoughts on the rumored, potentially confirmed, I'm not sure, Resident Evil 4 remake that is supposedly coming out. So if you're new to this channel or haven't seen my stuff before, this is not a gaming news channel. This isn't my usual thing where I just jump on the latest subjects and talk about them. That's not what I do. However, Resident Evil 4 remake, that's like a pretty big deal to me, and it's something I've been wanting to talk about. And I also wanted to put my perspective out there because I think it's going to diverge a little bit from the usual like mainstream type coverage you're going to see and stuff like that. And so, yeah, let's talk about it. Resident Evil 4 Remake. I've been actually anticipating this potential possibility for a very long time. Ever since they remade Resident Evil 2, and that got a strong reception, I was like, okay, this is Capcom we're talking about here. Resident Evil 2 got remade and got a good reception. They've already done remakes in the past, even on the GameCube, and those were strongly received. So the Resident Evil series just has this legacy of remaking their games pretty well and then re-releasing them and people liking them. And then they just did 3, I'm like, okay, 2 and 3, 4 is on the way, there's no stopping them. And so I just want to begin by talking about my love and passion for Resident Evil 4 and what about that game connects with me. So it is one of my favorite games of all time, bar none. I play Resident Evil 4 on a yearly basis. I clear it all the time. I've 100% cleared it, I think, 4 different times on like 4 different platforms. 100%, so that's beating the entire game standard and then in professional and then getting the high star ranks and mercenaries and beating assignment Ada and then going back through and unlocking like all the badass unlockable weapons and stuff. So yeah, I've put a lot of time and energy into Resident Evil 4. I absolutely love this game. And what about it that I really connect with is the action combat of the game, and it's kind of like this weird hybrid between a survival horror and an action game, but it's much more heavily focused on action elements. A lot of people say that online, that's not new information, but I'm a person who is really into action games much more than survival horror, so I don't actually play any of the other Resident Evil games because they don't really connect with me. So I don't play, Resident Evil 2, I don't play Resident Evil 5, because I felt like they kind of did a bad job with the action in that game. And then 6, and I feel like 5 and 6, they kind of tried to follow up with 4's really refined, strong action, but they just didn't quite understand what made 4 good, I think, as far as the action combat, where I don't think 5 and 6 have the correct amount of hits done, and they feel more like a third-person shooter type games. Resident Evil 4 specifically feels more like an action game, and I kind of think they didn't follow up with that well at all in 5 or 6. And then 7's like a first-person shooter, which is alright, but you know what I mean? So I specifically like Resident Evil 4. That's basically my favorite Resident Evil game by far. I don't play the other ones, I don't really care about the other ones that much. And so I wanted to put my thoughts out there as far as, because Resident Evil has many different types of fans, right? Some people love it for its survival horror aspects, and they really liked Resident Evil 7 because of that. And some people hate Resident Evil 5 and 6 and don't even like 4 that much because they're more of action games. And so I want to kind of expand on this a little bit. So it's inevitable, I think, that they're going to remake Resident Evil 4. And what's interesting is that we just had the Final Fantasy VII remake come out, and I've been kind of following along with that, mostly because it just sort of fascinates me, the reactions to the remake, more than the actual remake itself. And I covered it a little bit on the channel, but I've just been kind of experiencing that and kind of comparing it to what I'm seeing online. And some people have some extremely strong feelings about this Final Fantasy VII remake that aren't necessarily connected to necessarily the quality of the game, but it's more like the legacy of the game that they're remaking. And there's a lot of conversations right now about remakes and their places in the industry, if they're kind of just people being greedy and cashing out, or if they're trying to actually improve these games or bring them to a new generation and all that sort of stuff, whatever. To me, I think it's kind of a mixture of both. I think there is an aspect where they are just cashing in on, like the movie franchises do, right? Where they know, oh, this is an established IP, has an established audience, we're gonna make more money, or we're gonna have a more safe investment by remaking Final Fantasy VII than making a new Final Fantasy game or whatever. I think that's completely true. But I also think that it's not 100% cynicism that drives this either. I think in some cases it probably is, but when you look at the Resident Evil 2 remake and you look at the FF7 remake, to me it feels like there's also a certain amount of like passion from the devs themselves, where it's kind of like where they grew up with these games and now they're in the seats to make the remakes, so it's kind of like fans remaking the games or whatever, which I'm okay with. I don't really care that much about established canons and all those types of things, you know. But again, I'm a shmup action game player, right? So I'm not an RPG fan, so those types of things don't really matter to me all that much. So I think that's what makes Resident Evil 4 and Final Fantasy 7 a little bit different as far as the remakes, is where I can't really see too many Resident Evil 4 fans getting too worked up about if they change the story all that much. Maybe people would, but I feel like the story is pretty fun and pretty awesome, but it's not necessarily the biggest strongest factor for Resident Evil 4. I think it's more of like the environments, the gameplay. The characters are a lot of fun and stuff like that, but if they change story elements and stuff, I don't really see myself getting that upset about it. It's more like, what do I want them to do with this remake? And so that's why I'm making this video, is I want to put out kind of a different perspective, potentially. So I think there are 3 different courses they could kind of take this remake. One is that they make it more Resident Evil-ish, so more like a survival horror, so they tone down some of the action elements, basically make it more like Resident Evil 2 or something like that, where they tone down, suplexing stuff and like blowing people's heads off with shotguns and using giant laser cannons and stuff. They like tone it down and then make it more gritty or whatever, more realistic and gritty. That's like the direction I do not want to see happen, because I'll have no real interest in that whatsoever. If they do, whatever. It's not a big deal to me, but that I would not buy the game if that was what they went with, because that's not what appeals to me about Resident Evil 4. And then the other path I could see them going is the kind of just standard remake path, where they just actually remake the game, but then they make like changes here and there, and I could see them. I don't really want to see this happen necessarily. I think it could work, but it wouldn't actually come to life the way I'd want it to happen. If they did it this way, like a straight up remake where they just took Resident Evil 4 and they said, okay, let's up-res the graphics, let's make minor tweaks to the gameplay. I feel like actually remakes of that nature are the most difficult to truly pull off, because you have to have an expertise and mastery of what is appealing about the game. And so any slight change is going to be a big deal. Kind of like in a fighting game, when you're balancing a fighting game and you just add a little bit of frame data here or there. You're like, oh, this seems like a good idea. Then you have no idea the massive repercussions it could have later on. So I feel like if they did just a straight up remake where they just redid the graphics, they kept most of the same gameplay, but then they changed things a little bit. Like they said, well, let's make the camera system more modernish, right? So let's make it like a 3D shooter game. So now, because in Resident Evil 4, the camera system, I love the way it works, where you don't actually use the right stick all that much to like turn and aim. Instead, you use the main analog stick for pretty much everything, movement and aiming. And then if you want to turn around, there's actually a quick turn action. And some people don't actually know this, which is, I guess, to show you if they spend much time in the game. But yeah, and so Resident Evil, there's actually, if you press down A, you'll quick turn the other direction, which is like a technique you use. So there's like movement techniques and stuff based on the controls. So if they say, well, let's modernize the controls and make them, more in line with your regular third-person shooter type thing, I think that would massively, massively actually change the way the game plays, the way the game feels, and even stuff like, well, let's turn down the hit stun a little bit, because they did that in Resident Evil 5 and 6, where the hit stun in Resident Evil 4 is like perfect, absolutely perfect. When you knife enemies, when you shoot them, all that stuff is perfect. So they start messing with that a little bit, where they make the enemies more spongy, less reactive, less hit stun, less like visceral combat, more like you're just shooting stuff, which is kind of how 5 and 6 are. I feel like that's going to totally ruin the game as well. At least for me, like what makes Resident Evil so amazing, right? But so that's the thing that I kind of don't want to see either, because I just don't think they're going to totally get that right. And it also seems a little bit unnecessary, because Resident Evil 4 I have it on my PS4 and on my PC and all this, like every console that ever comes out on, even the Switch. Um, it stands up to time, right? It's a very well-made game. It's not in that window of the Resident Evils on the PlayStation 1 and whatever, like, where they were just really trying to figure out 3D stuff. By the time Resident Evil 4 came out, especially that game specifically, was kind of like, hey, we figured out how to make 3D action games good. Here it is, Resident Evil 4. So it's kind of like remaking Mario 64 a little bit, where, like, think about the Mario 64 remake on the DS. Like, that thing's not that great at all, right? And so that, I feel like there's no real necessary reason to do that, because even if you up-res the graphics, it's not going to be a huge difference, in my opinion, as far as the quality of the game. Oh, you must buy this because the graphics are a little bit better and stuff, because I think the original graphics, they hold up for me. I know some of those textures and stuff are a little like a Nintendo 64-like in times, but, you know, it doesn't bother me that much. But I mean, if they really want to remake it just to like redo the textures and redo the graphics and stuff like that, and they keep the gameplay really faithful, I would still buy it. I'd still play it. Why not? Especially if they added more content, more like more campaign stuff. Like, you get to play as Ada more, or maybe you get to play as Wesker more, or maybe you get, you know, like, I could really dig stuff like that. They added extra content, so I could be okay with them just kind of remaking it. But they'd have to be very, very careful to be faithful to certain systems, like making sure they're getting the hits done right, making sure they're getting the knife length right, because in Resident Evil 5 and 6, those knives, they're like way longer, which is good in some cases, but then like the hit stun's turned down, and so it doesn't quite feel as good as in Resident Evil 4, just all that sort of stuff. But yeah, I would love to see if they added extra content and things like that. So I'm not saying it's like totally impossible that just a straight up remake would work, but they'd have to be really careful with what they're doing not to mess up, especially if they added in like modern camera systems and stuff like that. I think that would really throw off the feel and flavor of the game quite a bit. And so then let's talk about the third direction, which is kind of what I hope they do, but is definitely the least likely, but what I would love to see happen. So I did a little bit of background research. I don't know if this is actually research, because a lot of this is straight up speculation, it sounds like. But anyway, so from what I've read, I think it was on Games Radar, was that the people in charge of this are the same people who did the Resident Evil 3 remake, and there's some connections between them being Platinum, you know, the Platinum staff, which makes sense because there's actually a lot of connection between Platinum and Capcom and stuff like that. And so I was thinking, just when I hear Platinum, I'm thinking, okay, like Bayonetta and stuff like that, or Star Fox Zero. I actually like Platinum quite a bit, a lot of their games that they've done. So I was thinking, okay, wouldn't it be interesting, and this is what I would love to see them do, is if they took that Resident Evil like kind of campiness and kind of craziness, and they just amped it up to the next level. I would love to see that. So they go all in on making it a more of an action game. So you're getting stuff like more like Devil May Cry, Bayonetta style Resident Evil 4. I think that would be awesome, right? Where like instead of just suplexing, like Leon can do all this kinds of crazy shit, like windmill kicks, and just making it over the top action, and like you get headshots, and Mercenaries mode, they have combos and stuff like that. So they bring in the combo system from Mercenaries mode into campaign mode, and you're like comboing up enemies and stuff, and that gives you more gold to buy more weapons from the Mercenaries and stuff. Like, they turn it into sort of an action game, like full on Devil May Cry style. I'd actually really, really like that. That's kind of the direction I'm really hoping they go. Especially with that connection to the Platinum staff. I think that is extremely unlikely. I think more than likely we're going to get the middle option, where it's going to be mostly sort of faithful, but they're going to try and update it and modernize it. But man, yeah, if they could add in some more action elements in the game and basically remix it to be very different from Resident Evil 4, and I think this is where the difference would come from something like Final Fantasy VII Remake, where Final Fantasy VII Remake has been something fans have wanted for a very, very long time. Everyone's talking about, for a long time, being a gamer, I just hear about people talking about people oh, we'd love it if they remade it because we could see it in like great graphics. You know, they could really flesh out what the PS1 could not do. But never among Resident Evil 4 fans are we sitting around being like, you know, could Capcom remake this game because, you know, the graphics, the textures just aren't there or whatever. Like, that doesn't... I've never heard someone say that before, and I think it's kind of more like they're remaking the game because they remade 2, and that was successful, and then they remade 3, and that was successful. It's like, well, we gotta keep this going, right? So they're remaking 4, but there's not a whole lot of reason to actually remake 4 because the original release really stands up. It's really good, and they're not going to actually make it better, I don't think, at all. But what they could do is they could, like, so instead of, like, Resident Evil 4 Remake, make it like Resident Evil 4 Remix, where they take Resident Evil 4 and they just amp it up and make it a completely, sort of like a completely different experience. So this is why I think even if they go the more survival horror, like, typical Resident Evil route with the game, which I know some people really want, I personally wouldn't like that, but if they did that, I would understand. I would kind of respect that as, okay, they're trying to remake it in a new way and, you know, be more faithful to the franchise or whatever like that. But for me, what I would love to see is if they just went all in on the action elements and just made it hella over the top. Give Leon, like, dual wielding and shit like that. I would absolutely love that. Or they could make you could play as, like, Wesker more, or you could play as... Basically make it more like Mercenaries mode. But make it the mainline game, because Mercenaries mode is lit. I mean, Mercenaries mode's awesome. And they add in kind of like a co-op stuff, or like online mercenary mode against people, like where you do score attacks against each other and stuff like that. Like, I could see if they made it more of like an action, more action, and just went further and further in that direction, I think it could be really cool. I don't think it would ever replace the original, but I don't think at this point... that's just not going to happen. I don't think people... I mean, I don't really know. I'm not in touch with modern gamers these days, but I don't think anyone's going to actually think this remake is replacing the original Resident Evil 4 just because it's so amazing. That's kind of like remaking Ninja Gaiden for the Xbox, right? It's like you can try and remake that game and replace it, but the original is so solid that you're always going to kind of come back to it. And so I think it'll be interesting to see how people react to this remake, because, you know, there is a bit of an outrage culture with the internet these days, and I'm a major Resident Evil 4 fan, like, for real, so I don't know if it's necessarily warranted to be too outraged about this, because we don't really have that whole Final Fantasy canon story stuff to worry about, right? So it's really just a question of, okay, they're making more Resident Evil 4 content. Is it good? Or should we just stick with the original? That's kind of just my views on it. I mean, Capcom, like I said, they're doing it for business reasons mostly, but I'm sure there's some love there for the original Resident Evil 4, of course. One of their most acclaimed, well-beloved games, right? It's the game they tried to build upon in 5 and 6 and just, I think, kind of failed there, but... They are on a hot streak, though. I'll give them that. So I'm kind of suspending my disbelief a little bit, because Capcom are on a hot streak. Our Devil May Cry 5 was really good. Surprisingly really good, right? Perhaps even the best in the series. You know, Special Edition 3 or 5, you know, there's a bit of a toss-up there, but... So if they delivered that well with 5, and they delivered that well with the previous remakes, I'm suspending my disbelief a little bit to see, okay, what if they really do go all in, and they really do understand what makes Resident Evil 4 cool? Because they kind of did that with 5, so they could do it again with Resident Evil 4 Remake. And then there's that Platinum connection, which I'm kind of in the favor of. You know, I like Platinum and their stuff, so I'm actually optimistic about this, but I'm trying to see this not as Resident Evil 4 Remake, I'm trying to see this as Resident Evil 4 Remix. Like, what can they do with it? What can they do to make it different and interesting? Because if they show gameplay and Leon's just, like, suplexing people and windmill kicking them and blowing his head off, dual wielding shotguns or some shit, I'll totally be into that. So anyway, that's just my video on this topic. I thought it'd be fun to put it out there, especially since, like, the gamer news cycle is everyone's just always hella jaded and hella mad about everything, and I understand if people can get that way about Final Fantasy VII because they're so connected to it emotionally and stuff like that, but I do feel as like a major Resident Evil 4 fan, it is a little bit unwarranted to get too fired up about Resident Evil 4 Remake coming out, other than, you know, you're just feeling mad that they're not making, because I think they are making a new Resident Evil 4. They are making another Resident Evil 2. That's the thing about this, is it's not like Resident Evil is in this slump and they just can't deliver, right? It's more like Resident Evil right now is just hella hot, and Capcom's just feeling themselves. So like, yeah, we're just gonna go all in. We're giving you new Resident Evils, we're giving you remakes, we're just going all in right now with Resident Evil. So I think let's try not to get too jaded about it to where we're getting mad just for the sake of getting mad, because I don't think this is quite the same situation as FF7 Remake, where Square Enix is just kind of faltering and failing over and over, and like Remakes was like their last chance to try and get some, you know, redeem themselves for the fans or whatever. Or if you're a Resident Evil fan right now, like, what do you got to complain about? They just keep delivering solid stuff. Now they're bringing 4, and hopefully they do a good job with it. And if not, whatever, right? You can always play Resident Evil 4, the original, on anything. It's everywhere. It's in 60 FPS, you know, high graphics, and you can even, like, there's mods on the PC. You can mod in all kinds of stuff. I think Resident Evil 4 is in a very good place. And so the remake could just make it, you know, just make it better, make people connect with the original more. I'm just very curious. I'm honestly very curious to see if Capcom understand Resident Evil 4 or if they don't. Like, that's mostly my curiosity, is to see, because they did understand Devil May Cry and they delivered on 5. So do they understand 4? Can they deliver on 4? Will the hot streak end here? I guess we'll see, right? So thanks for tuning in, and I'd like to thank my patrons: Dingo, Anthony A, Ben Wynn, Brian Shiver, Double Vision, Deps20XX, Dunpeel2064, EC2151, Full Set, Retro Schmupper, Gus, Kiwi, Jacob Spring, Jake Ryan, Neon Daggers, Scentmore Apps, Sarah Thumbs, Joe Angelo, John, K, Quentin, Maz, Nathaniel Davis, and Electron, Oklo Kugels, Omcall, Rysosis, Sugumo, Plasmo, Utakaya, Bahoy TV 100, Malays, and Mayhair Calendrian. Thanks for watching.